fight for truth and justice in the American way.
With great power comes great responsibility.
As a symbol, I can be incorruptible. I can be everlasting.
It says something when I could just play those audio clips and you'll likely recognize which character said what. On the one hand, it gets us around those troublesome little bots of copywriting, but also highlights how truly iconic these superheroes are. Part of it is obviously because of their age and massive number of adaptations they've gotten over the years across all media from radio to streaming. And while their quality has certainly varied over the years, there's no debate that Clark Kent, Bruce Wayne, and Peter Parker have had a massive influence on pop culture across the world. In particular, the Man of the Spiders has had a major underlying influence on our subject for today, if only because he helped lift the company behind it from the brink of death. As we covered previously on this channel, Toei was in some financial straits after their second Super Sentai series, Dengekitai Jacker, bombed and forced the company to take on a few more foreign commissions, which they had already been doing through what was called Toei Doga at the time. However, they managed to catch the big fish when they struck a deal with Marvel almost half a century before a certain rat got his greedy hands on it, and produced the 1981 Spider-Man series, which, while not the show everyone and their Uncle Ben memes to this day,
You're accusing me of pointing while you're...
It was still a very lucrative deal for Toei, as they managed to produce a tokusatsu out of it that also helped to restart their real cash cow in Super Sentai a year later. In a sense, you could say that Toei isn't dead to the wall crawler, to the point that, to this day, they still pay tribute to him as well as his other super brethren like Soups and Bats. Whether it be through some pretty on-the-nose motifs that somehow escape the view of the rat, or through some basic morals and principles. Not to say that the members of the Toei Trinity have been able to forge their own legacies, because they certainly have, but like many superheroes these days, you can feel the influence, at least on the base level. And that certainly applied for what was claimed to be the 20th anniversary Precure series, but really only on that base level. Yes, the show certainly had some of the motifs of those classic superheroes, and for the first half of the series, they even exemplified their morals and themes very well. However, after a certain point, it started to become clear that they were going in all the wrong directions. What brought about this, and how badly did it end up affecting the final product? Well, let's take a look at the story of some hero girls who both managed to rise and fall in more ways than one with Hirogaru Sky Precure. As we just said, the first half, specifically up until episode 23 of the show, was easily the stronger half, and in some ways, you could even argue it was one of the best starts for any series in this franchise. In just the first episode alone, we were introduced to our lead in Sora Haruwataru, we're given a good look at the interesting fantasy setting of Skyland and all of their copyright infringing bird steeds, and most importantly, start off one of the best pairings in this franchise. Yeah, right off the bat, I'll say that while I'm not the biggest Yuri shipper ever, I found Mashiro and Sora to be an absolutely adorable pair. Part of it was obviously some good chemistry, which should just be a given with both pairings of friendship and beyond. But more importantly, especially for this particular show, was the idea that they were heroes to each other. I think one of the most interesting story choices they made early on was having Sora be from an isekai, who then got transported to our world rather than it being the other way around like it usually is with these shows. If that had been the case, then the main lead would have been Mashiro, which it kind of was by the end, but let's focus on the good stuff first. Anyway, this of course led to the obvious fun that comes from having a fish out of water character, but as we said, it led to the two girls building admiration for each other, and no, not just in the Yuri sense. Rather, it was through their fascination in each other's cultures and beliefs. While Mashiro was a quarter Skylandian, which, by the way, we never did learn which of her parents was Yoyo's kid, but I digress, she was very much an average Earth girl who would pretty much react the same way anyone would when some boulder-splaying girl from the skies entered her life. Shocked and yet fascinated by Sora's dedication to becoming a hero girl, so much so that she would eventually join her in her adventures. Meanwhile, Sora admired Mashiro's caring nature that let her live a peaceful life that she couldn't really have as someone who constantly followed the path of the hero, so much so that she initially rejected the thought of even having her as a sidekick.
Batman works alone.
And that's probably the closest we'll get with the Batman comparisons, because really, these two are kinda more like the other two. I mean, it's pretty obvious, even before looking at interviews and design notes, that Sora's design is heavily modeled after the last son of Krypton. I mean, that cape and the color scheme that makes her look like she was designed by a different country. And on that note, while probably not intentionally borrowing from the cash cow of the other comic book company, Mashiro ended up being like the Spidey of the series. One was a visitor from another world with extraordinary abilities compared to us, granted not coming from a yellow sun, while the other was an otherwise normal human teenager thrust into some insane adventures with superpowered beings whilst trying to find their place in the world. Now, Mashiro didn't exactly follow the "with great power comes great responsibility" mantra, as Yoyo's not dead, and therefore she doesn't have a canon event that pushes her into realizing that she needs to use her powers responsibly, but she still does her part, so she kinda follows it. The point is that, like an actual being between those heroes, they were able to get along and even admire parts of their ideals in spite of an objectively massive power gap. That said, Sora initially had a much grander idol in the woman who saved her, Shalala. Now, normally for these overviews, we would actually save all character analysis for some later sections and actually recap the series and the plot that's often driven by the antagonist, but you see, that's kind of the issue with this show and its baddies. Yeah, the villains of this show kind of deserve their own special section to really highlight all of their issues, but more importantly, this show is very much character driven, so there's a lot to discuss here and for the layer breakdowns. In the case of the first 23 episodes, they did very much revolve around Sora, Mashiro, and later, after they visited Skyland, Captain Shalala of the Azure Guard. Having rescued her when she was just a child, Sora understandably wanted to grow up to be just like this lady with the massive ponytail, and maybe even surpass her with her twin tails. Okay, but seriously, there was anticipation to see this character who had appeared in the opening of the show, and Sora had hyped to the high heavens. Part of it was just to see the wholesome smile on Sora's face, though for me and a few others, there were some things that we'll get to later that they could have done to make for some much more interesting developments. Regardless, when Shalala was featured during the brief Skyland arc, she really did end up shaking up the status quo, giving Sora something to stride for, and also traumatized the girl with her apparent death. Yeah, even though I do agree the story arc could have stood to have at least one more episode to really flesh out the relationship between Shalala and Sora, it still did its job at being a legit shocking moment that seemed to have a massive effect on the blue lead. Remember this scene for later. Anyway, during this arc, there was also a very subtle plotline being spun in the background between our original duo. Yeah, don't worry, we didn't forget about Mashiro, and neither did this show. So, back when we did these reviews, we half-jokingly played it up like there was a love triangle between these three, but while romance wasn't exactly a thing, the writers were still indeed working an admiration angle, especially now that they were seemingly going back to their respective worlds. The fight seemed to be over, and Mashiro wasn't obligated to participate anymore, and could just go back to her normal, uneventful life, especially since Sora had achieved her dream of joining the Azure Guard. And yet, even as the literal toddler could tell, they didn't want to go their separate ways and remain each other's heroes. Thus, I guess you could say, kinda fortunately, they would end up sticking around through another mini-arc where they collected some MacGuffin energy to help revive the King and Queen of Skyland. And all of this would culminate in, honestly, one of my favorite two-parters of the whole franchise. Having been found by Battamonda and turned into a living battery for his strongest monster, Shalala essentially became both a hostage and an enemy to the Precure, granted not by choice, though it also could have been, but more on that later. But yeah, it was a pretty sadistically brilliant setup, as the Precure, or more specifically Sora, were caught in a massive conundrum, as if they were to defeat the monster and get the last bit of energy they needed to save the king and queen, they would also end up taking Shalala off of what was essentially her life support, as her body had been fully integrated with the monster. The only way they might have been able to save her was to cast a heal just as she came out, which would be like using a defibrillator on someone who was just taken off of life support. It's insanely risky with a high chance of fatality. Now, obviously, kids show, so that was never going to happen, outside of maybe hard catch, but still, it was a grim setup that kind of understandably made Sora blue screen. She knew that the literal fate of her kingdom lied in defeating this monster that would also continue to terrorize Earth, but she wasn't also willing to lose Shalala. Yes, she was a victim, but ultimately she was just one person who Sora just so happened to admire. She modeled her heroic ideals after her, and yet she couldn't live up to them if it meant shattering the vessel they came from. Sora, in many ways, had become a failure of a hero, and yet one girl didn't see it that way. One girl who was not only willing to pick up the slack for her, but also finally step up as her one true hero girl. As both this show and Hero Academia did with their openings, the idea of a character reaching to the back of their idol is obvious symbolism of them wanting to achieve the same greatness as them, even if it seems like a faraway dream, and yet interestingly, in this moment, the back Sora saw wasn't of Shalala, but rather of just Mashiro seeing and writing a supportive letter to her. Without context, the latter might seem insignificant, and yet for Sora, in this very moment, it more than easily replaced her former great idol. I'm not exaggerating when I say this one scene, and really just this one shot, still gets to me because it really is just a culmination of everything that's happened in the first 23 episodes of the show. It's just so poignant, as it really highlights that the only hero Sora ever really needed was a close friend who was always there for her. She certainly could still have her idols, and yet ultimately they could always fall, especially in Shalala's line of work, but a friend will always be there for you. And saying like that kinda makes me think like this show could have just have ended here. I mean, not really, because the Undagu Empire was still a thing, but as a high point for both Mashiro and Sora's character arcs, it really did feel like the show had peaked. And that was pretty much the case, as not only would I argue they never quite reached the same emotional heights as this, but I also think they ended up creating some significant plot holes due to likely some significant rewrites that came in the middle of production for reasons that we'll explain. Now granted, a lot of this is just us theorizing, but we also do have some interviews and inferences that we can use to make some logical conclusions. First, the one change that we can factually confirm based on an interview with voice actor Ken for Animage is that Battamonda's role was expanded on after he proved to be very popular after his initial appearances. These expansions start from at least the two-parter we just went over, and as a result, they also decided to give the character a whole redemption arc, which we'll get more into when we get into the character analysis. But the point is that while I really do like that two-parter, and actually wouldn't change anything about it, I'm also kind of wondering if it had any effect on another character's role in the story, but maybe we shouldn't get too ahead of ourselves just yet. First, I do want to bring up a theory that some of my commenters brought up. That being that perhaps this whole season was supposed to be an even more direct homage to the OG, in that it was going to start off as a duel, and later add in a third member, in this case probably Elle. Which of course would mean that these two wouldn't totally be a thing. What I mean by that is that maybe Tsubasa and Ageha were never meant to become cures, but rather just major supporting characters. Ageha would still drive Sora and Mashiro around, and even motivate the latter into becoming a cure, while Tsubasa would be their main confidant in Skyland. I say this because even as cures, they weren't all that important to the plot. Like, did you notice how we didn't bring up the two in that summary we just did for the first 23 episodes? I mean, sure, they had their debut episodes, but ultimately, they didn't really contribute to the main plot involving Skyland, or at least not in ways that required them to be cures, other than Ageha using her palette to heal Shalala, which has its own set of issues, but we'll get to that in a sec. The point is that we do suspect that they were promoted from side characters to cures entirely to drum up a little more hype for the show through the first adult cure, ignoring some of her similar age peers, and the first male cure, bullshit. And unfortunately, the first this and that tactic still remains to this day. And look, I'm not outright saying I dislike these characters or that they couldn't have worked at all as cures, but because their stories were likely shoehorned in the middle of production, well, that's exactly what they feel like. Characters forced into this conflict, and yet ultimately feeling like they're not totally necessary to the story, especially when the main plot ends up becoming more focused on the original duel, be it with the aforementioned episodes 22 and 23, the final battle, which, oh boy, there's a lot to say about that, and even All Stars F. For one reason, these two would end up getting separated from Sora and Mashiro, who would then solve most of the problems themselves, and yeah, it starts to become clear that this season likely was, and probably should have stayed with just being a duo to a trio formatted team. Which, on that note, let's bring up the next major issue with this season, and even more likely rewrites. So, another thing that comes with all Precure seasons are, of course, the toys. We often end up bringing them up in these overviews, and as always, we don't really see them as a good or bad thing necessarily, just a necessity for the franchise to keep going, of course. And in order to ensure optimum sales, Toei and Bandai tend to space out their releases by about 4 months to give everything breathing room and not overload the shelves. This then leads the show itself need to write around these releases by having the new toys be featured in one way or another. Of course, the trick they often relied on for this was the introduction of the 6th Ranger of the team, especially in recent years, where they were debuted about 4 months into the show, which tended to be around the 17th episode mark. The only exceptions to those dates were of course more the result of COVID and network hacking, but they still ended up debuting around those episodes. However, Hirogaru Sky was just a little different, and yeah, while Tsubasa and Ageha weren't technically considered to be the 6 Rangers of the show since they did appear in the opening from the very start, the colorful action mixed palette basically served the same role as any 6 Ranger toy, so there was no need to debut Elle as Pure Majesty just yet. With that in mind, you would assume that she and her Majestic Chronicle would debut maybe in the late 30s of the show, especially if it's going to be the last major toy that they were going to release for the season, so may as well get closer to Christmas, right? Well, no, instead they came out in the early 30s, which would be about a month before those projections. Again, this isn't necessarily solid evidence, but just look at the numbers for these first 2 quarters and compare them with last year's, which were the lowest of the franchise. I think Toei might have panicked and moved up Majesty's debut just to ensure some slightly better latter quarter sales numbers, and they'd especially want her to debut in time for All Stars F, where, as we said in that review, she was likely inserted in at the last minute, otherwise why wouldn't she transform for almost the entirety of the film, and only appeared in scenes where she wasn't even really needed, or could have easily been fulfilled by Puka. And to be fair, it did kind of work and did at least put them above Tropical Rouge, but at the same time, I think it had quite the negative effect on the show itself. Probably the most obvious victim of this change-up was Minoton, who noticeably got the shortest run of any antagonist in the show, only going from episodes 25 to 30 before Skearhead replaced him, and he didn't even appear in one of those episodes. I guess you could say he was the villain for a couple more episodes after that, but I'd argue he was more like a monster of the week controlled by Skearhead. Regardless, his lack of screen time and development wasn't the biggest issue. The real problem was how this show didn't seem like it was necessarily ready for Majesty's debut. I think because they moved up her debut, not only did we miss out on some possible build-up to the character, but they also might have felt like they could have sold more of Elle's original plushie, which they might have needed to in order to get these numbers. However, for this show, it did mean that Elle, in her baby form rather than her teenage form, ended up getting heavily pushed, leading to the character not getting that much development. Again, we'll get more into that with the individual character breakdowns, but assuming some of these theories are at least partially true, you are starting to see how the show might have been heavily rewritten, right? Because, as a likely result of it, I do think it led to one of the weakest third quarters of this whole franchise, as not only do we have a lot of filler episodes that aren't even really worth talking about for this overview, but even the plot significant ones didn't really advance things that much, especially in regards to the Skyland and Undaru Empire conflict. Things like the Majestic Chronicle and enigmatic nature would end up being unexplained until the tail end of the show. Thus, we may as well just get into the final core of the show, and since we already kind of brought him up, we should also talk about Skearhead, who pretty much represents the biggest issue with the show, the villains. For the final core of the show, Kaiserin Undaru and her right-hand man Skearhead served as the final villains. And to say that they saved the best for last would be an outright lie, because these two were the absolute worst, and not in the good sort of bad way. Then again, that statement could apply for most of the Undarku Empire. I mean, let's think for a second. What's one major aspect that all of the guys from the beginning of this video share? Well, for one thing, guys like this. I mean, it's just writing 101 that an engaging story, especially one centered around heroes, needs good villains. Bruce, Peter, and Clark all have extensive and memorable rogues galleries, but if we were to single out each of their more prominent baddies, I would choose Joker, Green Goblin, and Lex Luthor respectively. Each of them are rightfully considered to be the greatest villains of their respective series, as they often challenge the basic morals of their heroes. And they would commonly do this by making their lives living hells and make them question whether or not they should just end it permanently. And yet the heroes wouldn't do it because they know it goes against their ideals.
No, as much as I hate him for what he's done, I can't let this happen. Revenge is never justified.
I don't know what it was that bent your life out of shape, but maybe I've been there too.
I'm not the man who killed President Luthor. I wish to heaven that I were, but I'm not.
Of course, the reason they reached such low points to begin with was because they were pushed down by at least some fairly significant losses to these villains, which on their own shouldn't be considered a bad thing, at least for the story. It builds up the dramatic stakes and makes the final payoff for the heroes all the more rewarding. And yet, because of some arbitrary rules set by the toy higher-ups, and some boneheaded decisions they made ahead of time, not only did they hardly raise the stakes, but we also really didn't get to know these villains all that well. As we brought up multiple times through the main series review, director Koji Ogawa and head writer Yunosuke Kingetsu seemed to make the interesting choice to not include the typical villain interaction scenes and instead focus more on just the hero girls, which, as we just went over, is very much counterintuitive to this show. But okay, let's give it a chance. I mean, if they're gonna have the villains barely interact with each other, then that should free up a lot of time for some lore building that they should be able to do throughout the series and not just backload at the end of the show, and that's exactly what they did, isn't it? Yeah, for reasons that we can speculate on later. And while they did start to build up the conflict between the Empire and Skyland early on with episode 5, it was then left mostly untouched until we got a very clunky exposition dump in the form of a convenient trip to the past in episode 44. This was also done in the middle of a fight with Kaiserin using a power out of nowhere from the Majestic Chronicle.
Ooh, how convenient!
All of this because they couldn't be barred to sprinkle this sort of lore in between those 39 episodes. Like, I don't think it takes much just to have a little sidebar where someone like Yoyo could have referenced this stuff, even in the more fillery episodes, where they could relate it back to like the lesson of the day or something, but no, they just had to sideline the interesting lore for stuff like pointless fashion shows, tutorials, and dinosaurs who, okay, these guys actually could have had some interesting stuff to them, but as we'll see, they didn't even really bother to develop Skyland's lore either. But okay, if they're not even gonna really bother with the lore, then maybe they could at least build up the threat that the Empire posed. Which, as we went over earlier, they did actually manage to do effectively with Battamonda, the guy who they established was just a total lackey compared to everyone else. So surely they would make everyone after him more of a threat, you know, follow the typical rule of escalating conflicts and...
Nope.
Yep, along with Minoton exiting the show relatively quickly, and in spite of seeming like he'd be able to change things up for the better, to the point I fell for it, Skearhead never came off as a proper threat even by the end of the series. And why is that? Aside from the admittedly subjective matter of him having a very overly serious and boring personality, what did Battamonda have that he lacked in spite of always calling him the wordless villain? One word, a cliffhanger. No, I didn't mean for us, This is another thing that we've brought for this franchise multiple times, which should kind of tell you something, but it really seemed to affect this show the hardest. That being how the toy higher-ups seem to be under the impression that to be continues are too scary for their young target audience, and thus they restrict the number of times they can happen per season. Most notably, they want to limit the number of times the Precure were allowed to lose to the villains. Which to me, is just insane for a show like this. Going back to the Spider-Man comparisons again, having some version of the wall crawler losing someone close to them is such a recurring theme in their lore that it became a whole significant plot point in Across the Spider-Verse. And yeah, while Miles is kind of right in that if they have the ability to do so, Spider People should try to save who they can, what they could learn from that experience shouldn't be ignored either. We learn more through our losses rather than just victories all the time, and yet because the execs believe they'll scare off their viewers, they implemented this very creatively restrictive rule. And the funniest thing is, they're now currently highest grossing film in this franchise, pretty much acts as a counter argument to all of this. Yeah, while All-Stars F doesn't end with to be continued like Spider-Verse, the reflection scene they had near the climax kind of echoed the canon event scene from that film. The part where Miguel raised the argument that Spider-Man becomes a greater hero when faced with the harsh reality of morality. Meanwhile, and even though Precure doesn't always have to deal with death, and probably shouldn't, their most famous moments do tend to involve a lot of hardship. From almost losing friends to questioning why they're even superheroines in the first place, a lot of the episodes they chose for this scene were part 2s that followed significant losses to the villains. Moments like these not only help to humanize the Precure, showing that they're not infallible superheroines who can't learn from their mistakes, but they also tend to lead to some very engaging storylines of them rising from the ashes, which, as this scene itself proves, we have been enjoying for years. Hell, how did this movie itself open? Alright, with the whole planet being snapped by Supreme. Again, as the box numbers prove, people love seeing these sorts of stories, and yet because Toei feared upsetting a few Karens, they just decided it's not worth the risk, resulting in a season where the hero girls' victories didn't feel anywhere as near as earned as it was in this film. And as you might have noticed, we've kind of brought up these talking points previously, back in late September going into October, where we made 3 whole videos about villains. Partially, it was to celebrate Halloween at the time, but more importantly, we wanted to highlight aspects that at the time, the villains of Hirogaru Sky seemed to be lacking and subsequently never really fixed. The general lore and world building was lacking as they only ever really focused on Skyland and not the Empire, leaving us with just a pretty generic fantasy world that had a few things similar to ours, but they were anagrams.
Whoop-de-doo!
For the most part, they lacked a genuinely threatening villain like Joker that we'll explain more about in just a minute. And even if they want to go with more of a slice of life show, why didn't they make the Empire at least as entertaining as the Selfish Kingdom? Oh right, because they chose not to have the villains interact with each other, except near the end when suddenly they're all acting like they're roommates. Yeah, y'all really can't just take that cake and eat it if you've chosen to not let these characters interact for the most part throughout the show. Though with that in mind, let's just get right into the characters, and as always, we'll start off with the villains, working backwards in terms of importance. As such, let's start with the pigs. In spite of what one of them might say, there's really not that much difference between Minoton and Kaboton, at least in terms of their development and significance to the plot. Granted, as we said, the former got arguably less due to having a much lower episode count than everyone else. I mean, sure, Minoton had an interesting setup as an honorable warrior seeking the best challenge out of the Precure, and even tried to minimize casualties when he felt like it. He was kind of inconsistent between episodes. Regardless, he was never able to develop as much as, say, Kitaleski, who inevitably sought a warrior's death and instead became more of a stereotype of this archetype. No, and he also became the poster boy for Dare.
You shouldn't do drugs, because drugs are bad, okay?
Meanwhile, Kaboton was his opposite in terms of personality, focusing instead on juvenile and gross-out humor, and yes, I am using very big air quotes. He did have a couple more interesting moments when he did get desperate and tried to defeat the Precure, as Kaiserin gave him several all-or-nothing ultimatums that kind of meant zilch except for the last one, and even then, she just kind of gave up afterwards. But yeah, while it was a little interesting to see a villain give up his evil ways due to the pressure from his boss, there was hardly any real follow-up to his and Minoton's characters until they returned for the finale. Ultimately, they were just kind of goons who, if they had interacted more with other characters like the Oden vendor, the people at the gym, or hell, maybe each other, I'd have more to say, but otherwise, they just didn't bring home the bacon. Battamonda, in so many ways, is everything right and wrong with this show's villain writing. On the one hand, he is by far the best in terms of generating good heel heat, as the guy you actually want to see his face get caved in with how much he antagonized our heroines whilst acting like a pompous, entitled putz. All the while, he could actually back up his seemingly petty threats with a decent casualty count. Yeah, he didn't kill anyone, but he did almost bomb a whole kingdom, which resulted in Shalala getting KO'd, and he did at least incapacitate their king and queen for a decent amount of time. Thus, he objectively caused the most actual damage to the kingdom, at least in the long term, more so than the final bosses who were unable to get past a barrier. He was honestly great as a villain, until they felt like they needed to redeem him. Yeah, in spite of those crimes, plus how he managed to put Sora through 2 mental breakdowns, his popularity led the writers to figure that, hey, why don't we turn this perfectly good heel into a babyface? Hell, while we're at it, why don't we call in Yoshimi Narita to write a questionable ship between him and Mashiro? What's that? We're supporting a terrorist and an abuser? Well, who cares about that? We gotta satisfy those Fujoshi who are really into toxic relationships like Raylo. Yeah, needless to say, I really didn't like the direction they took this character in the latter half of the series, which is a real shame because, as we keep saying, the climax to his villain arc was the absolute peak of the show. And yet, as they kept adding to him, the less interesting he became, along with bringing up some very questionable messages for the target audience. Yeah, just ignore the fact that even during his supposed redemption, this a-hole was still trying to gaslight Mashiro into giving up her dream of becoming a picture book artist, but hey, we can fix him, right? Funny thing is, they actually did give him a good ending in his second to last major episode when he left after realizing his attempts at bringing Mashiro down to his level weren't working, and Skearhead made him realize that he had been lashing out due to his feelings of inadequacy. He wasn't really seeking to become a good guy or anything, but at least a better person rather than a perpetual loser, seemingly ending his story on a good, ambiguous note. But screw that, we gotta turn him into a total good guy and have Mashiro be the one to save him, so let's force in one more episode with him, even though we really should be trying to wrap up the show's main plot. Y'all had a perfectly good character that we could love to hate like freaking clothes, but I guess people just find evil Judai to be sexy, so we can't have nice things. And with that, we reach the 2 most problematic villains in this show, Kaiserin and her bald Yahtzee. Starting with the former, this character just had almost no presence throughout the entire show. Now, initially, Kaiserin did have something going, which I'm starting to notice a pattern here, with her abusing her lackeys and even almost killing Kaboton, but then she almost completely disappeared until like the final few episodes, with her only other voiced appearance happening during Her Majesty's debut, where she tried to intimidate the toddler, and that was it. Though, to be fair, that was pretty much all she had to her character. Just some Hot Topic Karen, who in order to avenge her father, used some pretty petty methods to get to a reincarnation of her mortal enemy, rather than just striking at the throat and attacking Skyland directly. But of course, they just had to drag out this plotline to the point of tedium before unloading her full backstory near the end of the show. It doesn't get us invested in the conflict when we're kept in the dark for so long, and without the supposed main villainess contributing that much to the narrative. I say supposed because it was then later revealed that her motivations were entirely fabricated by Skearhead, and she was mostly just his puppet. We'll save talk about some more scenarios they could have gone with, and some of the underlying themes they could have tied into it. But for now, Kaiserin just wasn't much of anything as a big bad, who I guess I should be glad was replaced, but what we got instead was... Again, aside from the subjective qualities of this character, the fact that Skearhead came over halfway into the series and eventually became the final boss was just not a great call, which maybe it wasn't even the original plan, but more on that later. For now though, even if he wasn't arguably a total drag of a villain, I don't think they could have properly built up his betrayal against Kaiserin all that well, especially when everything up until that point suggested the exact opposite, and as his whole thing was that he was incredibly loyal to her, even seemingly using his last few breaths to declare his love for her. And I think it actually would have been a decent send-off to a character that, while he was certainly evil, he was still very important to Kaiserin, and therefore, at least in some way, way, an unfortunate casualty of war. And no, you can't just justify something this out of nowhere as a good twist, otherwise we'd have to recognize M. Night Shyamalan as a good director. You need at least some foreshadowing to at least get us somewhat invested in this twist. Then again, there probably wasn't even that much to work with anyways, as I think he somehow had even less of a character than the constantly absent Kaiserin, as most of his episodes involved him just coming in, making a monster of the week, leave, rinse and repeat. Even in episodes where he did a little more, like unjustifiably saying Battamonda was a failure, when again he's the one who almost blew up the kingdom and incapacitated their rulers, what are you doing? There was hardly anything that developed him as a character, except for his dedication to Kaiserin, which again was pretty much negated by the twist, so yeah, it's a pretty much zero sum with his character, and we're just supposed to accept him as the final boss after he very arbitrarily renamed himself to Darkhead, like Megatron suddenly decided he needs to be called Galvatron because he has an edgier palette swap. Again, I have my own theories about the actual endgame of this show that probably really didn't involve this guy. Because if it didn't, and he did actually die in episode 48, I would have said that while he was a pretty boring general, he at least had a death that had meaning instead of becoming one of the most generic final bosses in this entire franchise. Again, we'll get to that stuff later, but as far as this character is concerned, yeah, I think I would prefer Don Thousand as a final boss. I mean, he's equally lame and uses really cheap cards, but at least they're laughably over the top.
Sorry, but with all due respect, that's just bullshit.
Moving into side characters, I will admit, this show actually has a pretty solid supporting cast. Yoyo was a good mentor character. I mean, she was mostly around just to provide exposition, and some good lessons of the day, like her episode where she explained the value of secondary skills that people can develop through their main interests. Sure, it would have been nice to see her more directly involved in her granddaughter's superheroing, or at the very least, tell us which of Mashiro's parents were her kid and therefore half Skylandian, but whatever, she fulfilled her role well enough. There were also some decent one-off characters like Miss Berry and the Dragon Dinosaurs, who probably deserved a lot more screen time, but that's more of a general writing problem of the show and its lack of proper world building, and it's not as though they were extremely important characters, I guess. However, this is where we get the character who's one of the biggest examples of wasted potential, Shalala. Like, holding off on the conspiracy theories for a little later in the video, why would a character who had as much build-up as her, and was even in the freaking opening, become such an afterthought for more than half the series? Yeah, after the Battamonda arc, where this legit badass female captain, with one of the coolest VAs in the industry providing her vocals, was turned into a damsel in distress, she just kinda disappeared for the rest of the show. At best, she shared half a Spotlight episode with Sora, which opens up its own can of worms that again we'll get to later. But yeah, for the most part, she was basically Sora's equivalent of All Might, who you do realize remained a constant fixture in Hero Aka, even after his somewhat retirement, not gonna spoil that. There's a lot more to discuss about her that we'll get into once we get to her disciple. First though, we gotta get through the rest of the cures, starting with the kind of sort of first toddler cure, even though Kota also started off as a baby before becoming a permanent teenager, which Elle also kind of did late into the series, and yeah, these characters have a lot of asterisks next to their whole first of something title, though really, it's kind of a pointless debate, because when you really get down to it, Kota was just a much better character. Like, the fact that they kept her in her baby form really hampered her from becoming anything more than just that gimmick. Yes, you can try to make the excuse that, well, she's just a baby, so they can't really do much with that, except there was always the option that they could have given her her teenage form and occasionally slipped back into her baby form, as shown near the end of the series, but again, I guess selling those plushies took priority. Honestly, I do think that they intended to have the teenage form come in a lot sooner, like right after she became a cure. Otherwise, why would Elaine seemingly give her two gifts for Suikumas with that and the veil? I mean, I guess you could say she was being generous, but thematically, it just doesn't quite make sense. It's a shame too, because there was a lot more they could have done with a teenage Elle for more of the series, as even the live stage show that acted as an epilogue to the series hinted at stuff like Tsubasa becoming a more direct teacher to her, and her taking up more princess duties. Also, remember this show for later, as there was a very important aspect about it that we will have to highlight. For now though, Elle was more just a plot device than anything. Yes, important story elements happened around her, but because she was a baby for most of the series, she didn't have much of an active hand in those events. I guess it's only fortunate that VA at least landed a much better magical girl role later. Ageha was seemingly a rather popular cure to come out of the season, and all I can say to that is,
I don't get it.
I mean, for clarification, I don't dislike any of the cures of this season, but other than maybe the main pair, none of them really left all that strong of an impression on me. And Ageha is probably the worst case of this, as she doesn't even have the excuse that she was a toddler. In fact, she was the total opposite in terms of physical age. Granted, she didn't always act like the resident adult of this team. Yeah, for supposedly the first adult cure, and ignoring the ones that turned 18 over the course of their series, she didn't exactly act all that mature, instead trying to be like one of those fellow kids and all that. Like, I get that she's technically a teen and was job training as a nursery teacher, but in that case, it doesn't exactly fulfill the adult cure title beyond just that, a title. As a result, I'd say she was just another slightly older cure like Yukari and Yuri, whilst not even having more actually mature plot lines like picking out colleges or taking care of a widowed mother. Oh, but wait, she had a bit of a strained relationship with her sisters due to a divorce that they didn't really highlight, like, at all. Yeah, legit, I had to look back at their episode because I thought there just had to be more to it, but no, not really. Like, why even bring up divorce as a plot point if you're not going to really do anything with it? It could have been used to inform a lot about Ageha's character, which, based on the timeline of events, she's had a pretty rough life, as after being separated from her sisters, she also had to part ways with Mashiro, a girl who she befriended shortly after the divorce and likely became like a surrogate sister to. There are good stories here that could be told about a young adult dealing with both her family issues and career path at the same time. Alas, like a lot of things in the show, they just really didn't commit to these ideas and instead just gave her a stereotypical big sister personality who, in order to come off as the adult of the team, was given the ability to just kind of win most fights with one of the most busted armaments in this entire franchise. Like, seriously, her rainbow palette made many fights just an afterthought after it was brought out. This was on top of her already being an effective tank and fighter, and yeah, we're starting to go into Mary Sue territory here. Not exactly or anything, but I still do find her to be rather overhyped, at least as a character, and especially as the supposed first adult cure. To me, that title was more earned by Midnight Police of the Polycure. Seriously, a cure that is their teacher is just a brilliant idea instead of Little Miss Gen Z here. Moving on to the other half of the B team, as we refer to them, we have Tsubasa. Now, before any of the wing stands come out with their pitchforks, because I know y'all exist, I will say right now that I do enjoy the first male cure to a certain degree, and you're still gonna get the pitchforks out, aren't you? I mean, for starters, I do think he had one of the stronger, if not the strongest, cure debuts for the show. He cleverly worked through his restraints as a flightless bird, and matched out with Kaboton. Granted, the latter isn't that much of a challenge, but his noble sacrifice to save Elle more than earned him his little transformation trinket. It also showed his willingness to accept the fact that he was still a ways away from achieving his dream of becoming a flyer, setting up an interesting little journey he could have in which he could overcome these shortcomings
And it's gone.
Yeah, after he became a cure that could just so happen to fly, he basically said that his journey towards flight was over, ignoring the fact that his base bird form, and in turn his whole race, still hadn't really discovered how to fly. I don't know, to me, and really like a lot of things in this show, Tsubasa's initial arc feels kind of incomplete if he doesn't learn how to fly without magical assistance. You can't really say you're spraying your wings when you've literally barely even flapped them. I guess you could say he was developing his knowledge, hence the wings of wisdom and all that, but again, stuff like the dinosaurs were just a one episode thing, and his journey to become a sage only really started at the tail end of the series. Meanwhile, the rest of the time, he acted as a pretty stereotypical little white knight, to the point that it became a meme that he'd princess carry every member of his team, kind of highlighting the lack of creativity given to the first male cure. Really, the fact that his cosplay outfit was delayed initially really showed Toei's lack of commitment to this whole first male cure thing. Yeah, don't think for a second that the parents' complaints are what forced the outfit to be created. It was likely always in production, but they wanted to release all the other goods first. Hell, my inner conspiracy theorist tells me that they were actually hoping for a Twitter uproar like this just to drum up a little extra attention. And even after it was released, the outfit was only available on Premium Bandai, the online store that sells products in very limited quantities because they know it's not going to sell great with the general consumer, which is actually understandable for a franchise with more of a young girl demographic. They've done the same thing with the male-oriented Kamen Rider and the supposed main female rider drivers. And while I certainly think that both franchises could stand to expand their horizons a little, these characters were likely never going to be a priority in the sales, and thus Tsubasa's arc were just kind of brushed aside to make room for everyone else. That is unless Ageha was involved. And as is almost always the case with relationships in this franchise, I kind of didn't care about it either way. I mean, for one thing, it at least wasn't an outright toxic relationship, Narita, and it never did grow beyond a sibling-esque relationship. Though, even from that perspective, it didn't really develop that much, with Ageha constantly referring to him as
Boy.
which Tsubasa rightfully called her out against, especially in one of my least favorite episodes of the series. And again, they really didn't do much with Ageha's family issues, which could have led to her becoming subconsciously clingy to him, but no, they just kind of had a fairly vanilla friendship when all is said and done. Not a bad relationship, as everyone likes vanilla ice cream, and these two had perfectly sweet moments together, but again, their stuff was often detached from some of the more main conflicts, as they were often separated from the original duo, which on that note, why don't we actually get to the main event of this video? I know, we've been pretty critical in this video so far, mostly in regards to the characters and the execution of the main plot. However, as was also the case with Tropical Rouge, the protagonist and Deuterogonist were really what held the show together. Starting with the latter, Mashiro, as we said, was basically the Spider-Man of the show, the everyday neighborhood kid who was propelled into some fantastical adventures. She may have had some Skyland blood in her, but it didn't really matter for her as she was born and raised as one of the realest Precures ever, in the sense that she reacted the same way most sane people would in her position. With that, and while her story was nowhere near as complicated as Peter Parker's, she did go through some very relatable complications in her life. Most notably, how, unlike any of her friends, she spent a little over the first core of the series with really no set goal. Now, to be fair, Mashiro was still young, and frankly, even Ageha did need to go straight into job training. However, seeing that old friend, plus Sora's unending dedication to becoming a hero, made her feel that much more insecure about what she could do, even initially hesitating over becoming a Precure. And yet, much like when she would end up picking up a different sort of pen, Mashiro quickly discovered that she had the most important things to become both a Precure and a picture book author. That being the will and the drive to just keep getting better, and sure enough, as the series went on, both her fighting and art skills became some of the best of her team. Maybe a little too much, but we'll get to that. The point is that Mashiro went through probably the most thorough and complete story arc of this show. A timid girl who, yes, didn't have any great talents or otherworldly abilities like her immediate partner, and only really had her pure kindness, which in the end was all she really needed to become a hero girl, and more importantly, a good friend. This then leads into our main lead, who I do really like, but also think they could have done her a lot better. Okay, let's just get the good stuff out of the way first. Sora, for the most part, is not just another idiot lead cure. Whatever color they take on, many Precure leads are written to be overly naive to the point that it does become a low ceiling to any sort of character development they might get. Not that it's impossible to develop these characters, or at least give them some narrative reason for their eccentricities, but many writers tend to think that they're likable enough as total clowns even as their acts start to wear thin. Sora, again for the most part, kind of bucks this trend by having both development and narrative reasons for her eccentricities. For one thing, she came from an isekai that's still relatively archaic to our modern world, and she was dead set on becoming a hero girl. In a sense, she was very much the Superman of the show, both as the alien from another world, who also happened to have very old-fashioned country boy-esque values, like someone who was raised on a farm in Kansas. She was kind, very amiable, and a pure badass at times, with legit one of the best individual finishers for a cure. And anytime Sora was a bit of an idiot, it could be justified by her fish out of water characteristic, or the writer thinking that they're still writing for Manatsu, who I actually do like her too, but they're not the same character, damn it. But yeah, she was a kid who had been inspired by heroes like Shalala to try and make all the difference she could by becoming the strongest hero she could. And that sort of setup could have been the basis for an interesting little hero arc that they even kind of started, but much like with Cody Rhodes, they left that story unfinished. Though he may be able to finish it this year. Don't screw it up, Rock. What was I talking about? Oh yeah, Sora's botched hero arc, which really this whole video has kind of been leading up to, as if it had been handled just a little better, it could have made this a top tier series rather than, well, we'll save that for the final thoughts. Anyway, as we have been saying for a good chunk of this video, the mid-season finale of the series was very much their peak, in that it was great, but also they never reached the same height when they fought someone who should have been a second-tier general. There just really wasn't any good fall to it, mostly because Sora took such a back seat for the latter half of the series, between Cure Majesty's debut and the rushed introduction and arc for the Kaiserin. All the while, there was a ton of dead space with filler episodes that could have been used to further her arc. I don't know, I just feel like they originally had a lot more plans for all sorts of twists and turns in the show. To prove my point, let's go back to analyzing Sora and talk about some of her character flaws that were kind of forgotten about. Now, one of her most obvious flaws that came right out of the horse's mouth was her fear that she'd be unable to save everyone, again very much a Superman issue.
All those things I can do, and I couldn't even save him.
Though it is also pretty much a universal issue for many heroes who want to become better. Now, that doesn't sound so bad on paper, but there are a couple things to consider. One is this line from Kamen Rider Zolda. Granted, he was saying this to a dangerous sociopath in Kamen Rider Tiger, who wouldn't understand heroism even if you showed him the first Richard Donner Superman film 1,000 times. But he did have a point in that a person who constantly dedicates themselves to becoming a hero can stray from the path just because it is a heavy burden that will weigh down on them. Which leads to the second point. When that mental instability starts to kick in and stuff like fear comes in, what else could that lead to?
Fear leads to anger. Anger leads to hate. Hate leads to suffering. Fear is the path to the dark side.
Yeah, you might have noticed we haven't brought up this little detail just yet. In the penultimate episode to the series, Sora was corrupted into a dark form that we'll call Fallen Sky, as I'm not sure if there's an official name to this, and I think it just sounds better than, say, Dark Sky. Anyway, this character ended up being a huge hit online, even though it only appeared for like all 5 minutes, and in the grand scheme of things, it didn't really affect the plot all that much.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, okay, yeah, okay!
And yet, people gravitated to edgy Sora for, I think, a few good reasons. One, obviously, being that great design. I mean, come on, black redesigns are always cooler looking than the original red, white, and blue. And two, I think people were just fascinated with them doing something different with Sora. Again, by this point in the series, she had kind of taken a back seat, so even just the prospect of some sort of dramatic development was worth getting excited over, even though it didn't really amount to much narratively. Most notably, how Sora would have been corrupted in the show. Skearhead, and no, I'm not gonna call him by his emo name, basically just slapped her with the Undagu energy and forcibly turned her evil. This is in spite of how one of the most interesting tropes behind corruption story arcs are those moments when the heroes succumb to it, at least a little by choice. Even if it involves some brainwashing, just seeing the hero's amiable moralities being warped into something dark is the basis for some gripping drama. And the thing is, they were kind of building to this in the show. As we just said, Sora had been showing signs that she was becoming an emotional wreck from constant heroing. She feared the possibility that she might not be strong enough to save the day, which, during the events of Battamonda's bombing attempt that also seemingly off Shalala, turned into full-blown anger that you could say was a little unbecoming of a hero girl. Now, to be fair, she did have every right to be angry in that moment, but what if that had been just the first sign that Sora had anger issues? What if there had been someone who had taken advantage of her chronic hero syndrome that led her to such an outburst? Going back to the Star Wars references, what if Sora had her own personal Palpatine in someone who she really respected? Again, just the fact that Shalala was all but dropped for the latter half of the series was odd, as there were even several hanging plot threads by the end. There were admittedly more minor details, like the pendant not playing a more prominent role than it did, but then in episode 42, there were some big ones, like her tightly grasping her teacup when Tsubasa brought up the anti-Ondargu barrier, and the fact that Skearhead talked about said barrier right after Shala left, and no one else aside from the Precure and her should have known about it. Like, just straight up objectively, that was a plot hole that was never filled in by the end of the show. To me, stuff like this seems like remnants of a Shalala betrayal arc in which she would have had some sort of close ties with the Empire. Hell, the fact that this episode was written by Isao Murayama, a known stickler for overarching plots, tells me that he was trying to push for this story arc that would have led to some actually good twists, unlike what we got in the show. Okay, so here's how I think the endgame would have played out if Shala had been a traitor. Granted, a lot of this is just my own rewrites, but I think it also matches up well with what was given to us in the show. First and foremost, Skearhead would have had his role greatly reduced. Not only would he have stayed dead the first time to give the scene actual meaning, but he'd also not have assassinated the Kaiser. Instead, it actually would have turned out to be Elle, who had succumbed to the pressures of her kingdom's prejudice against the Empire and made the difficult choice to prioritize her people's peace of mind. From there, she either blocked out that memory or even outright lied to the Precure about what actually happened that day. And then in the present, after they stop the Kaiserin, rather than Skearhead's spear, it's Shalala's sword that ends up piercing her, leaving everyone, especially Sora, in shock. She comes out and reveals that she had been a double agent for the Ondargu Empire, and like Skearhead, was disappointed that her queen had just surrendered. However, unlike that dude's whole mantra about power being everything in spite of having no real set goals in mind, Shalala had a goal to achieve absolute peace through tyranny.
You grabbed power, and with that power, we've made a world where no 8-year-old boy will ever lose his parents.
To do this, she would try to find an ideal vessel for the Ondargu energy to harness it and create a being who could enforce her warped views of peace. You could say she was trying to create a hero girl who could never stop. And while she tried to do this with the Kaiserin, she had also been grooming a backup who she quickly realized was a far better vessel. Then, through a little gaslighting and maybe even threatening Mashiro, she'd force Sora to willingly accept the energy rather than forcing it on her and therefore removing any autonomy from the situation. From there, Fallen Sky becomes the actual final boss, not the stupid snake, and is eventually stopped by Mashiro. And if Toei really doesn't want Precure to fight each other, why not have Sora fight her former idol in some rather karmic justice for betraying her like this? To me at least, this sort of scenario would play out a lot better than it does in the actual show, as it does cover some underdeveloped or forgotten plot lines. Now obviously, it would give Shalala a much more prominent role as a villain, which would be preferable than nothing at all, and also have the little side benefit of deepening the relationship between Sora and Mashiro, which is always a major plus. And more importantly, it would actually highlight themes like the Precure's need to be heroes that weren't in the main show. Yeah, remember that live performance we brought up earlier? Well, the main story of that show was all about the Precure designed for more adventures as heroes, which resulted in some residual Ondargu energy, granting their wish by creating new enemies, highlighting how intertwined good and evil are, and the importance of knowing when to hang up the cape so that a conflict can come to a proper resolution rather than just becoming an eternal power struggle. No, and it also featured an evil clone of Sora called Black Sky, who's technically different in this because clone, so we're sticking with Fallen. Regardless, and call me crazy, but I'm convinced this was based off of some of the original plans for the show. I mean, just as a stage show alone managed to explore the ideals of heroism much more than the show's final arc. Hell, I wouldn't be surprised if All Stars F also used some scrapped ideas, with Supreme kind of echoing that whole idea that those with power are worthiest of being called the Precure, even though there's a lot more to it than just that, and fighting an evil enemy of your literal own creation in Supreme's case. For instance, another theme that they kind of highlighted in the show, but really could have hit home with this scenario, is the idea that kindness can defeat hatred. After all, part of the reason the original war went on as long as it did was because of hatred, which even Elaine succumbed to. And even after it seemingly concluded, prejudice still existed. By removing Skearhead and his brainwashing, we could have had a conflict where neither side was truly in the right or wrong, but they were just stuck in an endless cycle of hatred that the Precure would have to close.
You don't have to hate! You can break the cycle of hatred!
Whenever Sora similarly lost her temper like Elaine, she was always brought back by her friends, in particular Elle and Mashiro. The latter especially represented this well, having been called the embodiment of kindness, who even managed to cut through Kaiserin's malice, and could have done the same with Sora if she had willingly given into her hatred and showed her might does not equal right. And again, going back to the Spider-Man references, she does kind of embody Uncle Ben's teachings that did manage to repel the evil black costume a few times. But no, instead we got a basic-ass good versus evil story, which, I actually would be okay with some other seasons, but not so much this one, as not only did they lay out the groundwork for it that they really didn't follow up on, but this is also the big anniversary season that was supposed to celebrate the heroism of this franchise, and frankly, with how disjointed and rushed this climax was, and really how poorly its themes were delivered in its latter half, I can think of several seasons that explored the ideals of heroism much better, and for a franchise that's all about superheroines, this season really should have gone above and beyond. So, how exactly did we end up here? Well, I think it was a combination of a lot of things we went over in this video. Between multiple rewrites, in order to accommodate the confirmed inclusion of more Battamonda and seemingly moving up Cure Majesty's debut, to counterintuitive choices like not having the villains interact with each other for most of the series, and more than anything, I think there was just a sheer lack of commitment to those slightly more mature storylines, even though there seemed to be at least some small traces left over, just gaslighting us at the prospect of something more. Instead, we got a meandering second half with a lot more slice-of-life stories, which again would have been fine in something like, say, Tropical Rouge, but not in a more serialized show like this. And again, if at least some of our theories about the mid-production rewrites are correct, then like a house of cards, it will inevitably fall from the extra weight. With all that said, did I dislike this show? Yes, and kind of no. Again, no matter what, the first half of the series was still fantastic, and even afterwards, Sora and Mashiro remained one of my favorite pairings of this franchise. Two friends who, through some beautiful visual storytelling, were able to acknowledge each other as their heroes. Hell, even though I didn't care for them as much, the rest of the team were fine, as at least everyone brought their own hero story and motivations. Whether it be to live up to someone they admired, wanting to protect the next generation, seeking knowledge, or, I guess, discover more about herself. Again, Elle really should have been a teenager much sooner. Regardless, the first half of the series did have high moments, dare I say sky high, but yet it's because of those high points that I'm just left all the more disappointed that the rest of the story feels incomplete. As even the ending farewells felt more like they were being done out of obligation to do it like other series, rather than wanting to give a proper bookend to the show. If they really wanted to make us feel something, why not show the Cures starting to drift apart because they are now living separately? It would be immediate, but it is something many people go through when friends move away even a small distance, but again, there's that lack of commitment and follow through with their stories. Like, we dropped Wonderful Precure from the regular review schedule because I just felt it wasn't for me, and yet I can't say I was disappointed with it because I went in with no real expectations, and can't say I'm expecting much more in the coming year. This series and Ultima that ran near its tail end though, were both Precure seasons that just left me disappointed and kind of disillusioned with this franchise. Believe me, I want to like these shows, but with toys seemingly being more worried about their sales or kowtowing to concerned parent groups, I think this franchise is being choked out by its own creators. If I were to score it, I guess I'd give it a 5 because it really is half and half, but as a season that was on paper meant to celebrate 20 years of this franchise, it honestly kind of loses out to Happiness Charge, which I didn't even think was that bad, but even if I did, I think I still like it more than a series that had its wings clipped. Thank you for watching what's likely going to be a rather lengthy little analysis video, but one that I thankfully was really passionate about. As I said, Wonderful will remain in short review form for the time being, but more long-form Precure reviews like Max Heart and other related analysis videos will still be coming along with more seasonal anime reviews we'll be doing for the coming year. So look forward to it. And until then though, farewell for now my friends, and oh come on guys, it's just a blue eyes white dragon. Y'all are making way too big a deal out of it.